Now that we've covered the basics of instrumental conditioning, as well as different schedules of reinforcement, we're ready to move into the motivational mechanisms that underlie instrumental conditioning. So we're going to get into some of the more theoretical aspects of instrumental conditioning today. So we're going to move right along into Chapter 7, and the first of our topics is going to be to cover the two broad approaches to motivation. These are two radically different approaches to understanding why instrumental conditioning occurs. The first of which, the associative structures approach, is what we would consider a molecular theory because it's focusing on sort of the immediate, short-term, one trial at a time scenario, whereas the concept of behavioral regulation is going to be a more molar approach, meaning it's taking that step back and looking at the big picture. Now today, I'm just going to cover the first of these two approaches. So we're going to zoom in on our associative structure of instrumental conditioning, and then we'll cover behavioral regulation as well as the rest of the chapter in Thursday's lecture. As you might imagine, the first of these two approaches really deals with associations. So even though this idea originated with Thorndike and his original studies, it ends up carrying over and connecting really nicely with the theoretical tradition of Pavlovian conditioning. There's a lot of compatible and even equivalent ideas, so we're going to see a lot of crossover between those concepts. And as I've mentioned, this is considered a more narrow or molecular approach because it's focusing on individual responses and specific outcomes. So looking at sort of a given trial kind of a scale. And it's going to care about the specific stimuli that are the antecedents of behavior, the things that are leading to the behaviors that are occurring. Because of this very narrow approach, this is a great way, because this is a very narrow approach, it allows us to consider behaviors in isolation. So because we're focusing on sort of single trials and very small scale things, it allows us to look at things in a more controlled environment. And this also means that it's a good equivalent to allow us to try and study some of the neural mechanisms of learning. Again, because it's very controlled and very small scale. This is a lot less applicable to big picture or real world applications. That's where our second set of theories comes into play. And so we'll talk about that second one in the next lecture. But to get us started, we're going to talk about the three-term contingency. And this three-term contingency isn't actually specific to either of the two approaches that we're going to be talking about in this chapter. This kind of applies for both. Now, the textbook says that Thorndike was the first of our reported researchers who made the connection between these associations requiring more than just a response and a reinforcer. Thorndike made the comment that there was also some kind of specific environmental stimulus or stimuli. The whole situation was also involved in whatever we were learning about the association between the response that was made and the reinforcing outcome that occurred. So including that idea of the stimulus context, the environment in which the behavior is occurring, adds this S term to the idea of a response and a reinforcer. So Thorndike also talked about our instrumental response, which we're going to call R, and then our response outcome, which we call O, probably because using R again would be confusing, but we can also call our response outcome our reinforcer, because as I mentioned before, we're going to be focusing mostly on reinforcement. We'll deal with punishment separately later on in the course. So Our response outcome can also be considered a reinforcer, but again, having a second R would be very confusing. So response outcome or reinforcer will all be referred to as O. And as I said, this isn't just specific to our associative structure idea. This also applies for our second approach that we're going to look at a little bit later on, because this three-term contingency lines up with Skinner's ideas about instrumental conditioning. So this SRO idea and this diagram here are going to carry through the rest of this chapter and honestly for the rest of the course. So you're really going to want to familiarize yourself with this three-term contingency, with this diagram, and with these three variables, where we have the stimulus, context, or the environment in which the behavior is going to occur, our instrumental response, or the behavior, and the response outcome that occurs as a result of the behavior. All right, so let's actually get into this idea of the associative structure of instrumental conditioning. Let's talk about approach number 1. So the core idea of this approach is that the three terms from our three-term contingency allow for different kinds of associations to be formed. So from these three different corners here, we can form three different associations. We have our SR association, and this is the one that was really important to Thorndike, which we'll get into in just a minute, but that's the association between the stimulus context and the instrumental response. We can also have an association between the stimulus context and the response outcome. We can also have an association between our instrumental response and our response outcome. So there's the three different possible combinations that we can have here with three different kinds of arrows showing up. And we can break these down and talk about these each individually as we work through the rest of the chapter. But before we start breaking things down, let's look at an example that helps illustrate these three different types of associations that can form. And we're going to use an example that we already talked about previously, which is the example of using operant conditioning with birds in an operant box. So as a quick refresher of what this situation is here, we have our feeder, where there's a food cup that will rise when the bird hops into the feeder and breaks an infrared beam under the correct conditions. There's also a speaker here for experiments that need a speaker, and then we have the bird here on a perch, ready to hop into the feeder should the situation call for it. And here we have a red light, and in this instance, our red light is our S. That's our stimulus context, where the light is on. What the outcome is if the bird makes a particular response by hopping into the feeder or going to the feeder while that light is on, the outcome is that the food cup will rise and the bird gets access to food. So if we wanted to break this down into the three types of associations, we can say for our SR association, so this one here, the bird can only make the response of going into the feeder if this stimulus is present. So the bird can only go into the feeder if the red light is on. Otherwise, if they do this when the red light is not on, then nothing is going to happen. So the red light needs to be on. There needs to be a particular context cue for this response to mean anything. For our SO association, the connection between the light being on and getting food, if the light is on, then there is an opportunity for the bird to get food. Which brings us to our RO association, where you can only get this reinforcer of getting the food if you make this particular response. So one last time, you can make this go response, you can do this correct response if the stimulus is present, if that red light is on. You can get food if that light is on, and if you make this response, that is the only way to get food. So we have those three different associations where there's some combination of the light being on, some combination with getting or doing the response, and getting food, depending on how we can connect these three. Okay, so let's actually break these down based on each of the three types of associations, and then we'll come back to our example once we've touched on all of these specific associations and what's going on, and then we'll see how much we've changed our understanding once we get to that point. So the first of these is our SR association, this association right here. And as I said, this was the association that Thorndike thought was the most important when it comes to instrumental conditioning. This SR relationship was essential to Thorndike's law of effect. The idea was actually very similar to Pavlovian conditioning, where as this stimulus is followed by this particular response, there's a stronger and stronger association between the stimulus and the response. And according to Thorndike, the reinforcers, this O term, merely served to sort of stamp in, was his specific term, to stamp in that association between the stimulus and the response. So the role of our O, the role of our reinforcer, is to strengthen the relationship between the stimulus and the response. That O term isn't directly involved in that association, it's just the mechanism by which it comes to exist. Once you've associated that stimulus and that response strongly enough, the outcome or the reinforcer actually becomes kind of useless. It doesn't have any purpose once that association is formed. So the implications here are that there's no real learning about that reinforcer or the relationship between the response and the outcome. Those don't matter under Thorndike's idea of this SR association. So if we take it one step further, this states that the motivation for instrumental conditioning, or sort of instrumental behavior, is the activation of this SR association. So the contextual stimuli that are present are going to activate this association and lead to that automatic response that only exists because it had been previously reinforced. But the O term doesn't matter anymore. The presence of that particular stimulus should eventually be sufficient to lead to that behavior occurring. As I said, it sounds very Pavlovian because the stimulus leads immediately to that response, sort of regardless of the outcome here. And this idea was actually very popular for quite a long time, but was eventually mostly abandoned when the 1960s rolled around and the cognitive revolution occurred. Because when that cognitive revolution happened, they wanted to start including other things like the importance of that outcome term. However, we have seen a recent resurgence of this idea of the importance of that SR association. Specifically, this SR association is thought to be really important when it comes to habits. So things that we do out of habit, things that happen automatically without cognitive involvement. So habits are behaviors that we tend to do the same way each time we do them. They occur pretty much automatically, and we often do them without thinking. So if you've ever sat at your computer and had a bowl of chips beside you, and before you even realized it, your chips were gone, and you didn't really remember eating any of them because you did it automatically. You did it habitually. So the idea would be that a lot of these habit-type behaviors would occur solely through these SR associations, where when there's a stimulus present, the response automatically happens. And of course, This is a fantastic model to view drug addiction through. The idea that being in a particular environment, having particular stimuli present, would be that environmental context, the stimulus context, and then when that context is present, then a behavioral response happens about automatically. So again, our reinforcer might have been involved in establishing the original SR association, in stamping in that link between those two concepts. But once that association is established, the reinforcer is irrelevant. The outcome isn't motivating you to mindlessly eat chips. You're eating those chips simply because they're present. So the stimulus of the chips being present automatically leads to the behavior of eating them because they were present. So there's lots and lots of research getting into habits and especially, as I said, drug addiction and things like that, because those types of behaviors can be very damaging and seem to occur regardless of the outcomes or regardless of the reinforcers being present or not. A lot of drug addiction will persist even when the situations that used to be reinforcing, say feeling good, stop happening. So drug addiction can persist even if the outcome starts to become negative. And that's because the theory is that it's completely driven by the association between the stimulus and the response, and the outcome is now irrelevant. All right, so our next concept is to look at our SO associations, and this is going to tie in with expectancy. So the idea here is that you come to expect something, some kind of outcome, when you encounter a particular stimulus that activates a memory of a significant event from your past. So with our bird in the operant box example, the stimulus of the red light makes them expect that this red light stimulus is associated with food. So I can get food, there's the opportunity to get food because this stimulus is present. The basic process of learning about a stimulus and a reinforcer is Pavlovian conditioning. But in order to understand this reward expectancy aspect, we need to consider how those Pavlovian processes get folded into this instrumental conditioning idea. So we've already said that this SR association comes to exist because of our reinforcer or our outcome. And now we're expanding on that to say that the fact that this outcome will only occur in a specific context or in the presence of specific stimuli forms another important association that can relate to the instrumental learning process. And in fact, these two ideas, this SR association and the SO association, were the two major factors pointed out by Hull and Spence when they first started trying to understand what was going on within instrumental responses. Their basic idea was that the instrumental response was motivated by two factors. The first being that the presence of a stimulus evokes the instrumental response, RR, directly through an SR association, so that's this branch here, and at the same time, the instrumental response is made specifically because of an expectancy of reward, that SO association. So again, expanding on the idea that there's an SR association that exists now specifically because of the association between our S and our O. And this basic idea was the precursor to our modern two-process theory, which we're going to go into right here. So our modern two-process theory is based mostly on, well, it originally started with Hull and Spence, but was then finalized and sort of given the form that we're used to seeing now by Rescorla and Solomon. So again, we're seeing the name Rescorla. That is one of the biggest names in learning literature. But this two-process theory assumes that there are two distinct types of learning, Pavlovian conditioning and instrumental conditioning. No big surprise there, that's kind of what we've covered so far in the course. But the idea is that during instrumental conditioning, you have certain stimuli, S's, that are present when the response is reinforced. So when a particular outcome or reinforcer is delivered, our O component. An SO association comes to form through Pavlovian conditioning. It's kind of like a CSUS association, but not quite. But the important part is that our SO association activates an emotional state, which will then motivate our instrumental behavior. The type of emotional state that happens will depend on the type of reinforcer, and the emotional state can be either positive or negative, appetitive or aversive, depending on that type of reinforcer. So if we head back to our bird in an operant box example, we have our SO association being shown here. So we know that the presence of this particular stimulus, our light being on, gives the opportunity for reinforcement to be had. So this can create a positive emotional state. We have a net positive here. So it is motivating the behavior that will then follow. So our stimulus now creates this positive emotional state because of the association with that good or appetitive outcome, which means that the bird will do the behavior, they will make the response that then gets them that positive outcome. So the expectancy of getting this good reward, this link will then motivate the occurrence of the stimulus then being followed by the given response. So the S to the R. So how can we actually test this idea that our SO association is actually what's motivating our instrumental behavior? We can test this using a transfer of control experiment, which is also sometimes called a Pavlovian instrumental transfer experiment, which is a mouthful, but either of those apply to the same basic idea. And the theory behind this is that if a Pavlovian SO association is motivating the instrumental behavior that we're seeing, then presenting a Pavlovian CS should alter our instrumental behavior that we end up observing. So what does this process look like? There are going to be 3 steps, and I'm going to hop back and forth between this slide here and the one that follows it, and that's just because this table here includes our 3 steps, phase 1, 2, and then our transfer test is stage 3, and those line up with the 1, 2, and 3 here. Now, step 1 is going to involve instrumental conditioning. So, for example, we can have a lever press leading to food. So you train a rat in an operant box that pressing the lever gets them food pellets as a reinforcer. Step 2 is to create an association between a tone and food. So in here is our Pavlovian conditioning where you would remove the lever and now the playing of a tone would be paired with food. So the same rat in the same operant box, but they no longer have access to the lever. Instead, now whenever they hear a tone, they would receive food. Now because step 1 only involved the response and the outcome, and step 2 only involved the stimulus and the outcome, then there's no way that an SR association could have been learned. Now, I will note here that this asterisk is in place because while we've talked about instrumental conditioning being done first and then the Pavlovian conditioning being done second, you could do it in the opposite order. It doesn't really matter. But what does matter is that in one of them, you have instrumental conditioning, and in the other, you have Pavlovian conditioning, and we've set it up in such a way that there can be no association present between the stimulus and the response. So at this point, there's no association between the tone and pressing the lever because the tone and the lever have never been presented together. And once we've set this all up, we can have our third step, which is our transfer test. And so we'll have the option to do instrumental responding. So the rat has the option of pressing the lever to get food, but we're also going to include presentations of our Pavlovian CS. We're also going to present our tone periodically throughout the time that the rat is in the box. And we want to see if there's any difference in the rate of responding when the tone is present versus when the tone is not present. So our prediction here is if our Pavlovian SO association is motivating that instrumental response, then we should end up seeing an increase in our instrumental responding when our conditioned stimulus, when that tone is being presented. So if that SO association at the top, if this association is what's driving our behavior, when our stimulus, when that tone is present, we should see an increase in that behavioral response, in that instrumental response, because of the motivating relationship here. So that's our motivation from that association. And that can only happen because of that SO portion. Because as we said, there was no opportunity for a direct SR association to have been learned because the lever and the tone were never presented together. So this experiment is called Pavlovian Instrumental Transfer Test because it's specifically determining how an independently established Pavlovian CS transfers to influence or motivate our instrumental responding. So it's kind of named in a logical fashion for once. Now, we've only talked about positive emotions, so our positive emotions increasing that instrumental responding. If you have the same setup, but instead a negative emotion is elicited, maybe a shock is delivered instead of some reinforcer, then you can have negative emotions developed, and then you would see the opposite of what we just talked about, where instead of increasing our instrumental responding, you could see a decrease in the instrumental responding. So with appetitive and aversive, respectively, we can have that positive and negative emotion elicited by our CS. However, we should also note that the CS can elicit more than just positive or negative emotional states. It can also elicit reward-specific expectancies. As an example of these specific behaviors or overt behaviors that could also be elicited in this setup, if you think back to Chapter 3, we talked about sign tracking or auto-shaping, where we could see movement toward or even interaction with a stimulus that signals the potential availability of a reinforcer. So if we think of this kind of behavior as occurring towards, say, our red light example, as a contextual stimulus, but also as a signal of the potential to receive positive reinforcement, that movement towards the red light could be interpreted as an instrumental response, especially in our bird and an operant box setup, because if the bird moves towards the light, they break the beam in the feeder. So it would register as an instrumental response. So we have to keep in mind that these sign tracking type behaviors can either add to or take away from the instrumental responding that we're observing, depending on the experimental situation. So the presence of that CS can elicit other behaviors that aren't directly related to the instrumental response. And we have to keep in mind that things can get a little bit complicated. So how can we test for the existence of these reward-specific expectancies? Well, of course, we can talk about it on the next slide, where we have an example with a transfer of control using two CSs. So this is actually going to be the same setup as this example here, where we're going to have a phase 1, 2, and then a transfer test. But instead of just having one CS, which in this situation was food, now we're going to have two, one for food and one for water. So we're basically going to do this process effectively twice. And so as I said before, we can do either our instrumental conditioning or our Pavlovian conditioning first. So let's start with the order that the text lists here, which is starting with our Pavlovian. So we have a CS, one for food and one for water. So we'll consider an operant box, and we'll have on the left side a light, and on the right side a light. The left one is associated with food and the right one with water. To set up this conditioned association, the left light would turn on briefly and then food would be delivered. The right light would turn on briefly and then water would be delivered. And repeated until there's an association between this light and food and that light and water. Then we could do the instrumental conditioning part of it, where there would be a lever, one on the left, where when they press this lever, they receive food. One on the right, where when they press this one, they receive water. And then for the testing phase, we would allow the rat access to pressing the lever, and we would see what the lever pressing looks like when either the left light is lit or the right light is lit. And our two predictions are that if this is only based on that positive emotional state, then we should see an increase in lever pressing for both sides. Even if the food light is lit, we should still see an increase in responding for both food and water. However, if it's a reward-specific expectancy, if the rat has this association that's related to this light and food and this lever and food, then when this light is on, we would expect an increase in the lever pressing for that lever only and not see an increase in the lever pressing on the water lever. And that is exactly what we end up seeing, which lines up with that reward-specific idea and not just a positive emotional state. The textbook has another example just like this one, but using a slightly different setup. So if you want to go over this again using a different example, you can check out page 190 on the textbook, and it'll walk you through the same basic setup, but with a slightly different twist on it. Okay, so we've talked about our SR associations and our SO associations, and those are the two that are accounted for in our two-process theory. However, in instrumental conditioning, our reinforcer is not predicted by our S alone. We also have to take into account the RO associations here. So the outcome happens if the organism makes a response, specifically in the presence of RS. And this ignoring of these RO associations is actually really counterintuitive if we think about how we verbally describe our behavior. I am doing this behavior to get that thing. So I'm opening this drawer to get a snack out of it. So I'm doing this behavior, this R, in order to receive that outcome, that O. So when we talk about it, we always talk about the R and the O, but all the theories we've discussed so far have ignored this part of the process, which is kind of weird. So, are there RO associations, and how do we test for these? And the process of testing for an RO association actually uses a procedure that we've already discussed in depth. And this would be back in Chapter 4 when we talked about our US devaluation. So if we devalue our outcome, our O, then we can test for the presence of that R. Does responding decrease when we devalue the outcome? So back in Chapter 4, we tested specifically for SR versus SS learning, and we could see a dropping in responding if we devalued some outcomes in some situations. And this is another situation where the textbook has an example, but I'm going to use a different one. And so this is a study done by Colwill and Rescorla in the 80s, where rats were reinforced for pushing a rod either to the left or the right. Going in one direction, say the left, would get them food, and going in the other direction, say to the right, would get them sugar water, both of which are appealing. And so once the rats have been trained up and they know that going to the left gets them food and going to the right gets them sugar water, then they could devalue one of those reinforcers using lithium chloride injections. Basically, either the food or the water would make the rats sick. So they've devalued, let's say, food, and then test the rat's preference. So let's look at our predictions here. If it's just an SO association, then we would see a decrease in both responses because the devaluation had affected the properties of our stimulus. So by reducing our value of the outcome, we should then affect somehow the view of our stimulus, meaning our environment. And because the environment is affected, we'd see a decrease in both responses because both responses are occurring in that particular environment. If it's an RO association, then one response, the one that was specifically resulting or linking to that devalued outcome, should be lower. So if we devalued food, then we would see less of the moving the rod to the left because that was the response that led to that specific outcome. But the other response, moving the rod to the right, shouldn't be affected because we didn't affect that secondary outcome of the sugar water. So if we see a drop in only one response, that would suggest that there are separate RO associations formed in this scenario. And if it's just an SR association, then the reinforcer, that outcome, is irrelevant, and both levels of responding should stay the same even after the decrease in that reinforcer's value. And what we tend to observe is more like the RO association prediction, which tells us that there is some kind of RO association involved in our instrumental responses. And for our last slide in today's lecture, we're going to start putting it all together, and we can talk about the hierarchical S and then in brackets RO relations, where we bring it all together and have S and R and O all involved. So we've seen that the RO associations alone cannot be responsible for producing instrumental behaviors. So the RO associations can activate an expectancy of the reinforcer, but it's not sufficient to tell us what caused that response in the first place. So we specifically care that these RO associations are activated in the presence of S. That's why the S is outside of the brackets. The S is affecting our RO association. So it's activating that RO association. And we've already kind of talked about the interrelation between SR and O by talking about the law of effect and Thorndike's suggestion that S is activating that particular response and that the association between the S and the R is stamped in by the O. But our big take home here is that we have a 3-term contingency, and all 3 of those terms should be involved in any explanation that we have of our instrumental behavior. So our instrumental conditioning is happening as some kind of relationship between all 3 terms. And we're going to talk a little bit more in the next lecture when we get into the behavioral regulation side of things and start looking at Skinner and the more broad approach towards instrumental conditioning motivations. So we'll pick up there next time.